Hello everybody and welcome to episode 62 of Show For You, where today we'll be going over the Chimera Ant arc of Hunter x Hunter. Now, this arc is very long. It's a 60 episode arc, so I apologize if I kind of leave out a couple of things here and there, because I can't help that I don't remember everything that happened, but I'm just going to go over the general plot points and kind of what I thought on the arc as a whole. But yeah, like I said, this episode is the largest arc in Hunter x Hunter with a 60 episode run. It spans from episode 76 to 136. But yeah, I'll just kind of get into it and slowly show you how my opinion progressed about it. So we start off at the end of Greed Island. We see as Gon and Killua end up getting off Greed Island, and they spawn in this random area. They kind of like teleport in at this random area where there's snow, and there's this dude lingering over there. And this dude apparently attacks them, but he's actually saving them from this little beast known as a Chimera Ant. And these Chimera Ants are a type of monster which has a structural system in which the queen produces continuously genetically superior offspring until ultimately she reaches a king, and then the king goes and makes his own kingdom and all that, and his own queens, so that they can go and make other areas and all that good stuff. But yeah, so we learn about this, and we learn the man's name is Kite, and now Kite is a previous apprentice of Gene Freese, Gon's dad, or Gon's dad. And we see as they kind of communicate, and we ultimately learn that they have some backstory because Gon and Kite actually met while Gon was a very young child, and we learn later on that Nin can be acquired through making contact with someone with, so say someone with Nin punches someone without Nin, they can acquire Nin by that. And I don't know if it's necessarily definitive, but it's kind of presented as Gon acquired his Nin from Kite. And so he has a deep relationship with Kite, even over the short time they're together. But through all this, we ultimately learn that Kite is in the area looking to eradicate a Chimera Ant queen who has been progressively producing more and more complex beings through the consumption of animals. And so we kind of see as this progresses, and we just kind of get some background information about the Hunter Association looking over this and why they sent out Kite and all that stuff, because the possibility of a Chimera Ant infestation spreading is dangerous to the human population, because they could eventually start in advance and start eating people, which is what we see. Because as it slowly progresses, we see as the Chimera Ants become more and more ravenous, become more and more intelligent, and therefore they start eating people. Now, once they start eating people, they start acquiring more and more humanistic abilities and personalities, because the queen has always been able to speak, and she's always been a relatively human ant. However, as she starts to consume more and more humans and produce more and more offspring, they become more and more powerful with each rendition of offspring. And we just see as eventually they actually end up acquiring the abilities of Nin via consuming humans, because they ultimately end up eating some Nin users. But yeah, because we see as some of the people from the Hunter exams that we saw ultimately end up being here, and they actually get attacked because, like I said, the Hunter Association was trying to quell this, so they'd send in some other people, and these Nin users ended up getting eaten. But yeah, so we also see as they go around, they raid local villages, because all this is taking place in the NGL, which is a dictatorship ran by this man by the name of Diego. However, he has a figurehead, kind of a puppet master, whose name is Bezef, that's his name. And yeah, Bezef kind of runs the show, but Diego is the figurehead, and he's the dictator. And it's taking place in all this very secure, shut down area. But yeah, we see as the Chimera Ants slowly progress and become more and more advanced. And through this, eventually we see as the Chimera Ants learn how to spread Nin to one of each other. So they learn that if a person with Nin hits another person, then it gives Nin to that person. And they start spreading their Nin like crazy via this method. And so all of this eventually culminates to the queen eventually being able to produce bodyguards for the king. Chimera Ants that would be, physically and combatively superior enough to actually defend the king and act as his bodyguards. So we also see as there are some Queen's Guard that are more powerful, but there are none as powerful as the King's Guard until the king is actually born. And we see these produced, and we kind of just see throughout all of this as Gon and Killua are kind of training with Kite, and ultimately this ends up culminating with the production of the King's Guard. Now we see the King's Guard, and one of the first ones we're introduced to is Neferpito. She's kind of like this cat-looking Chimera Ant with bug legs, cat ears, cat tail, and kind of a human-looking body in general. She's a bipedal. But, yeah, or bipedal. But yeah, so we see this, and ultimately we see as Neferpito is able to track Nin, and she tracks down Kite because she's wanting to fight a high-level Nin user. And Gon and Killua recognize this as well, that there is a powerful source coming for them, and so does Kite. So Kite tries to send off Gon and Killua, but they're no, we're gonna stay, because I mean they had some prior encounters with some smaller Chimera ants, which they had struggled with. Gon and Killua had struggled, and Kite had as well. Also, I forgot to mention on Kite's Nin ability, what he does is he has like this spinner wheel, and he summons the spinner wheel whenever he's going into combat, and I believe it has one of 7 numbers, and whichever number it lands on gives him a varying weapon. I believe we only actually get to see like 3 of them because events happen to Kite, but yeah, we see as he uses this ability to deal with circumstances, though it's completely random, so he's kind of given the luck of the draw depending on if he's going to do well in a fight or not, based on how well he can use that weapon. But we see that he is quite well versed with the weapons that he uses. But yeah, so Pito is searching them down, and ultimately she ends up finding them. And Gon and Killua won't go away, even though Kite knows that they will absolutely be beaten by Pito because he's just too powerful. But yeah, so with that we see as Pito rushes in, and in defense of Gon and Killua, Kite loses his arm. And then he sends them off, and he's like, yo, you're only going to hold me back, so go. So he sends them off to run and go back to, I guess, human lands in the Hunter Association. And during this, we see as Pito absolutely annihilates Kite. She decapitates him on the spot, and Kite loses because, I mean, he was at a underhanded disadvantage because he lost his arm because he was defending others, and this led to Kite's demise. Therefore, Gon and Killua, though it is debatable whether or not Kite would have actually survived a full fight with Pito, I believe he probably would have, at least, because, I mean, Pito, we do see, is very powerful, but, like, I don't know who would actually have won that, but we know that he is a previous apprentice of Gene, and he's relatively close to Gene in power, so I really just don't know. I would have liked to see that fight, actually, like a full power Kite versus Pito. But we see as Kite decapitates Pito, and she's like, okay, I'm going to keep Kite for practicing, because she has the ability called this doctor ability, or puppeteer ability. She has 2 separate abilities. She has a puppeteer, and she has Dr. Blythe, which can essentially heal all wounds besides mortal ones. Well, not mortal ones, but besides like people who are dead. She can't resuscitate people, or resurrect people, but she can heal about any wound. And we see that later on. But then we see as they go along and Gon and Killua run off, they end up leaving the NGL, and this gets us into kind of the preparation, because the Chimera arc is kind of divided into like 3 main stages. It's not technically done it, but like I observed it as such. So we have kind of have our introduction like this. We get to learn about the Chimera ants, we get to see everything, and then we kind of move on to preparation. There's kind of like this intermission period between like preparation for eventual attack on the palace and defeat of the king, and then we have like the actual battle in the latter half of the arc. But yeah, so this is kind of like the intermission period. They end up running off, and they go and tell what has happened to Kite and how they're going to plan on to retrieve Kite once they get powerful enough and strong enough. And so they ultimately end up going and training with Bisky. And Bisky kind of puts them through the ropes and all that stuff. She teaches them some more abilities and more powers, and just trains them. They also have to go up against these 2 new characters called Knuckle and Shoot. We see as Gon repetitively has to go up against Knuckle to try and beat him to get a spot to actually go on the expedition to fight the Chimera ants, because we get to introduce to some other characters. We know Netero already because he played ball with the boys on the zipline, like in, I think, the Hunter exam arc, yeah. And we see 2 new characters by the name of Nove and Moral. Now, Moral is a very cool character because what he does is he has this big old pipe, and he smokes it, and it causes different things. Like, he can make mirages out of smoke. He can do this thing called Smoke Joe, which can trap someone in smoke. He can grab people with smoke. So it's just really interesting power. And then we have Nove, and Nove can essentially teleport between a room that exists outside of the actual world, kind of like a training room, like some blank room, and the real world. And he can create these entrances to the room everywhere. And we actually see this putting him in use later on. But, yeah, so then, like I said, they, Gon and Killua are practicing, and we see as Bisky at one point kind of talking with Killua, and she's like, you need to quit giving up whenever you don't believe you can just absolutely obliterate a opponent. Because we see that Killua often does run off when he knows he cannot completely obliterate an opponent, and instead he overestimates them and believes them to be stronger than they actually are. Which, I mean, is a good thing to do, but it is not good when you're going to run away. And we see as his kind of breaks him down a little bit, and eventually he's kind of debating on fighting, and ultimately they go to fight Knuckle and Shoot for the final time. Well, Shoot, I don't think they actually ever fight Shoot. Shoot kind of just cowers behind a tree and watches. But we actually see, no, I think Killua does end up facing Shoot briefly, but I don't believe it's anything like massive. But we see as Knuckle and Gon end up facing up, and we get to see Gon's ability, we get to see Knuckles' ability, which is essentially, it's called APR. And what it does is it attaches to a nin user, and it slowly drains their nin to the point in which they can't use it. And once this point is reached, you can't use your nin for a month, because we see this happen with Gon, because in their final big fight, we see as Gon's nin is drained away, and then he eventually isn't able to use it for a month, so then Knuckle and Shoot actually get to go to the NGL rather than Gon and Killua at the time, but they're allowed to after they recover and all that. But Shoot's ability is, I don't know exactly how to explain. I mean, it's kind of like Buggy's ability in a way, because he can kind of just break his body into pieces and control him with Nin. But yeah, so then we see that, and we also see as Netero, Nove, and Moral are attempting to take in or go into the NGL and defeat the Chimera Ants before the birth of a king. And they're doing this, and they're doing it pretty successfully. They're doing it more of an espionage way, and they do it by having Nove put like a smoke screen over all the area where the Chimera Ants live in their nest, and they just slowly take them out one by one by transporting Chimera Ants to the room that Nove can create and has access to, kind of like the storeroom in Kagurabachi in a way. And we see as Netero is in there, and he fights them, and then just kind of cycles. But they are actually unable to get to the queen before the king is born, and we see the birth of the king. Now, the king looks sick, and this ultimately does lead, though, to the death of the queen. And the king, we see as he goes off, and he plans to take over this area. But ultimately, before this ends up happening, we see as everyone kind of verges on the queen, and we see as they're kind of discussing, and we get to learn that she has a name for the king before she dies, and his name is Meruem. Or Meruem, yeah. But, yeah, so we see after this, we kind of see as the Chimerans start to break down. They always kind of lose their ranks for a while before the queen's death, but they start to break down and all that. And we see this is further boosted because Meruem kind of goes around killing Chimera Ants who were friends and all that stuff, so it is hard for them to see. Like, there's this one Penguin Chimera Ant that Meruem kills that was very dear to one of the more prominent Chimeras we see with Colt. But, yeah, so we move on from that, and ultimately we see as they start kind of going off in their own ways to fulfill their own desires, while also being quite subservient to the king. Because the king is a beast of a nin user. But, yeah, we see this, and ultimately we kind of see as Gon and Killua kind of, like, I guess, do some more training and more powering up while they wait for Gon to reacquire his nin abilities. We also see as we're introduced to a character by the name of Palm. Palm is... She technically grooms Gon because they end up going on a date at one point, and he's like, I don't know, he's like 13, 14 at this point, and she was late, or she was in her 20s, I know that much, so that's a little peculiar, but she's actually I guess, not a good guy, because she didn't do anything to Gon, but she went on a date with a minor, but, yeah, she is on the good guy's side, I'll say that, but, yep, we kind of get introduced to her, and then ultimately our goal is to beat the king now, because the king has been born, and he goes into the palace where Diego is living and all that good stuff, and he wipes out, like, everything. He wipes out everything besides Bizef. Bizef is the kind of, like, actual ruler of the kingdom, and he controls the people, predominantly, since he is, like, the actual ruler. So Bizef is not killed, and Bizef is allowed to live in the bunker of the building where he keeps all of his, like, I guess, harem of women, and, we just kind of see as he goes about his own thing like he was going on prior, but he is now kind of subservient to Meruem. And we see as Meruem's guard kind of goes about him and guards him as bodyguards do. But then we move on to the actual preparation, and now they have to prepare to end up beating the king. And we see as Netero goes off for a while, because Netero's just, he's like, I gotta go talk with an old friend. And so we see this, and we see as Nove and Moro predominantly do some things. They end up going in and trying to set up for the eventual, like, takeover of the castle. Now, during this time, we also see as Meruem and his bodyguard come up with the plan to take all of the citizens of the NGL and to cull them to the point in which Meruem can consume the best of the best. Because to Meruem, the best type of food is nin users. And we see this as he goes around villages and he tries regular humans and he's like, I'm not satisfied by this. But then we see as he starts eating nin users and more powerful beings, and it's more satisfying to him. And it moves along. And we see as the plan for Moral and Nove is to have Nove set up a bunch of storehouses around the perimeter of the palace and actually like within it if you can get in, and then have the the backup Moral, Knuckle, Shoot, Gon, Killua, and all that to come in through those. And so we see this play out, and ultimately we see as we get Nove going about and doing all this stuff, and he is quite successful in this. However, at one point he goes into the actual palace itself, and he encounters this very powerful Nin. It's just Neferpitos, and this causes him to age. It terrifies him so deeply to the bone that it causes him to become geriatric. But yeah, like I said, we see his Moral also helps set up. He helps trying to defend the people because they are ultimately planning on becoming brainwashed so they can all come to the palace and Marrow can readily kill them. What we see is he sets up a defense force around the city, and he has to fight a bunch of the smoke mirages and all that stuff. He has to fight this one character by the name of Leo. Leo. It's like a tiger-looking Chimera ant, and he ends up fighting him. And this is all, like I said, in pursuit to kind of defend the people and set up just surveillance around the area with his smoke mirages. But also, we see as Gon and Killua, like I said, are preparing, they get ready to go, and ultimately they start to help out. Now, this is where, like I said, there's more to that preparation area, but it's honestly kind of boring. I just wasn't big on the preparation because it seemed like it took so long, it took up such a majority of the Chimera Ant arc, when it actually wasn't too, massive, but it still kind of bored me, because I was like, okay, this is getting a little slow. And that's when we kind of move into the battle portion of things. Now, the battle part is also kind of slow to begin with, because we see as Nove sends all of them in, and like I said, throughout all this, we've had quite a few Chimera Ant battles with some higher ups, like these squadron leaders and all that, and we get introduced to some characters that actually become important later on, like Melioron and Ikalgo, which we see as Gon and Killua are infiltrating the NGL again. And we see this play out, and we kind of get to see as Palm, well, this actually doesn't really happen to the battle, so I'll discuss that later, but they have them all come in. And the battle plan actually doesn't work out at first because they were not expecting to see, because I'll let your name off the bodyguards because they become very important. We have Yuppie, who's this big buff centaur eventually, but at first he's just kind of a bipedal. But then we also see Neferpitou, who I've already explained. We see Poof. Now Poof is a butterfly kind of looking Chimera Ant, and what his power is to create segments which break his body off, and he can genetically modify them, which is super overpowered as we see later on. And he has the ability to control people, which he ends up using with the citizens of the NGO to bring them all to the palace. But yeah, so after that, we see they all infiltrate, and they see Yuppie at the staircase rather than Neferpitou, who they had expected to be there. And while they're doing this, they ultimately kind of just start improvising and all going on their own ways. Now, each of them have been assigned a specific person to fight. Netero has been assigned to fight the king, and Nove and Moral, I believe, were assigned to fight. I believe it was Yuppie. Yeah, they were assigned to fight Yuppie. Knuckle and Shoot were to Poof, and Neferpitou was to Gon and Killua. And we see this goes on, and they ultimately end up like I said, improvising. We see as Shoot and Knuckle actually end up fighting with Yuppie. However, Knuckle is, like I said, Melioron is one who actually ends up joining their forces, even though he's a Chimera Ant in the later portion of the preparation, and he is a Chimera Ant who essentially has no combative powers, but he has the ability to make things invisible because he's kind of like a chameleon. And so we see as they try and get past Knuckles so they can eventually get to the king, and this kind of doesn't really work out for him much because Shoot actually ends up getting beat down by Yuppie because he has this weird tentacle ability, kind of like when Tenshin Han ends up his forearm stance, but instead Yuppie has a bunch of tentacles that fling around and all that stuff. But yeah, so we see as this goes along, and we see kind of the fight between Yuppie and Shoot. Shoot gets kind of badly beat, and Yuppie goes around looking for Knuckle and Melioron. And ultimately, Knuckle and Melioron end up getting separated. We see as Moral is searching down for Poof. No, I can't even remember who was I can't remember exactly who was. I know Gon and Killua were assigned to fight Neferpitou, but I don't remember who was assigned to fight Yuppie and Poof. But I do know that Meruem was assigned to fight, Netero was assigned to fight Meruem. But, yeah, we see this progresses along. And then I was still this is kind of slow. I wasn't big on the fight between Shoot and Yuppie. I did kind of like it because of the emotional tugs it had. but then they descended. This is where the Chimera Ant arc gets its praise, its glory. From the heavens come down Netero and Zeno. Zeno is Killua's granddad. And this is literally one of the most aura moments I've ever seen, like, all fiction. Like, I cannot state how sick it was. Because we see them coming down on, I can't remember what the move's called. It's called, like, Divine Dragon or something like that. And we see as Zeno is raining down, like, Nin bombs, essentially. Even though they're not really bombs, they're kind of like arrows. I think they're called, like, dragon meteors or something like that. And they're just, like, raining them down. And we see as the palace starts to get destroyed due to all of this. We see as... oh, yeah, I forgot to mention this. We actually get to see a lot of Meruem in the preparation arc. And during this, he is playing a bunch of board games. And we see as he's playing stuff like Shogi, and every time he beats the person, he kills them. However, once it comes to this local game by the name of Gongi, we see as he brings in this young girl. And this young girl is beating him. He cannot beat her. He keeps getting beat and beat and beat. Her name is Komugi, eventually, which we learn. And she is a top tier. She's like legit the best in the world at Gongi. And Meruem, through Komugi, slowly becomes more and more humane. He slowly becomes adapted to her, and he doesn't want to kill her. He never ends up killing her because she grows on him, and this actually caused a major shift in Meruem. But during this attack by Zeno, she is pierced. She, like, her entire abdomen is, like, obliterated, essentially. And she is essentially left to die, and we see as their Gungi board is destroyed and all that stuff. But then after this, Netero and Zeno pull up on Meruem, and Meruem's surprisingly not, like, outraged by this. Because we never get to see a lot of emotion from Meruem, but we do get to see he gets angered at points. Or at least disgruntled. And as they're standing there, ultimately, Zeno and Netero are, like, flabbergasted by how powerful the Nin is coming off Meruem. And he just blows by them at one point to go and fight off, because they agree to go and fight in a different area, and this startles them. We see as Komugi is left in the background, and then Netero and Meruem go to fight, because Zeno's like, all I was paid for was to pull up in this insanely aura-beholding fashion and then go. So that's what he ends up doing. He just goes up and leaving. And there's this one character by the name of Cheeto that we actually see a moral fight earlier on in the preparation kind of part of it. And he tries to pull up on Zeno, and Zeno's like, nah, man, I'd obliterate you. And Cheeto's like, nah, man, you wouldn't obliterate me. And then Shiva, who is, as you know, Killua's dad, just blasts down on Cheeto out of nowhere, and then they head off. But, yeah, then I guess probably the best thing to discuss is, like, the fights between Knuckle and Yuppie. We get to see Knuckle and Yuppie fight, and Knuckle ultimately ends up getting beat very badly by this, and he puts APR on Yuppie so that he can track him, but nothing is really beating Yuppie, because Yuppie is a very powerful entity. And we don't really see anyone fight, like, one-on-one with Poof, because Poof isn't much of a combative character, but we do see occasionally run-ins with him, like, I believe Killua ran in with him at one point. Yeah, he did. And we see as they just kind of go about and do their own things. We kind of see a few other battles. We see as Ikalgo is attempting to penetrate into the NGL and all that, or the palace. And we get some story with Palm, because Palm was sent in during the preparation period to acquire a look at where and see who the king was, and, like, get some info on him, because what she planned on doing was acting as one of the women that Bezef would take in, and which she successfully ended up doing, and then she infiltrated the palace via that. And she was meant to go and find the king, relay that information back via clairvoyance to the hunters, and then ultimately possibly have to sacrifice herself. But we see as she ends up getting lost, and we know that she did not see the king because she doesn't relay that back to him, and ultimately we see that she actually got trapped by the Chimera ants and put in a cocoon. But yeah, like I said, we see all these kind of battles here and there, and they're all pretty solid. And at one point we actually get to see Killua fight with some new power against Yuppie. And, oh yeah, also I forgot to mention, I know I've had to go back a couple times, but there is a lot of stuff here, so I apologize, but there is a lot of stuff, so I can't help but forget, but then slowly remember stuff. But, during the preparation area, when Gon and Killua are re-infiltrating the NGL, they got separated, and we see as Killua is fighting some Chimera ants, and he's held back because he's this desire to run away that Illumi instilled in him. Well, Illumi actually had control of him because he implanted one of his needles into Killua's head, and Killua actually ends up removing this, and that's kind of like a limit breaker for Killua, because now he can exceed his limit and actually stay when he should want to flee. But yeah, so we see as this goes along, and we actually see Killua and Yuppie fight briefly, and it's actually a pretty cool fight, and we see Killua use this new power. I believe he calls it Godspeed, and it is essentially like enshrouding himself with electricity. It kind of looks like when Yoruichi goes like Thunder God form, and it is just super cool looking. I really like that form of Killua. It was probably one of my like favorite designs we've seen so far of like a main cast character in Hunter x Hunter. But yeah, we get to see him use this briefly and all that stuff. And then ultimately we progress along. We see as they are slowly once again trying to progress and find Palm, which Ikalgo actually ends up doing. And I believe both Ikalgo, I can't remember exactly who finds her, but I believe it's Ikalgo. When they find her, we see that she was imprisoned in the cocoon, and Palm was actually turned into a Chimera ant. And, well, part ant, because she actually isn't completely ant, and we see this because Killua ends up running into her. And through this, they have a brief conversation about Gon, they fight briefly, and all of this eventually leads to him essentially reinstilling more of the humanity into Palm, and Palm is kind of broken from her Chimera ant control. And then she eventually becomes an ally and helps later on. But then we see as I'd probably say the best fight all of Hunter x Hunter happens so far, and it is the Meruem and Netero fight. Now this fight goes crazy. We get a little bit of background information from Netero. We learned that he was essentially a warrior monk, because he, like, for years he would sit out in the forest and punch, pray, and he did this for so long. And this eventually led to him becomes like super powered. We see as he fights like so many other people in dojos and all that stuff, and he beats them every single time. And we see as people like bow to him in learning, even and desire to learn, even though they're like elders and stuff like that. But yeah, we see this, and we just learn more about Netero. We see that he has like kind of a power similar to, I mean, I'd kind of say it's like if Sengoku's Buddha power wasn't actually connected to him, because he has like this big statue with like 20 arms, and it's very powerful. We see it like slam on Meruem and all that stuff, but Meruem is able to easily dodge all this stuff and all that good, I guess, pizzazz. But this fight goes crazy. Like, I cannot do it justice enough, so I highly recommend, even if like you don't care about Hunter x Hunter, watch this fight because it's a great fight. But we see as Netero slowly tries more and more to beat Meruem, but Meruem slowly gets the head up on him. He actually ends up cutting off one of his arms, and then he actually ends up cutting up one of his legs. And we see as Netero pulls out like the final big blast on Meruem, and it does damage, but not a lot. So once he uses up all of his energy, because it makes him go from what he usually looks like to being a shriveled old man. And this is also kind of where we get to see him do his little heart attack on Meruem. But yeah, we see as it shrivels him up, and he's left essentially the husk of what he previously was. Meruem pulls up, and he's like, "Tell me what my name was," because that's the reason why they fought. Because Meruem wanted to know what his name was, and he didn't really have any reason to fight Netero. But Netero was like, "I'm gonna fight you. So if you win, I'll give you the award of knowing what your name is. Because if I win, I get the award of obliterating the king of the Chimera ants." Yeah, so he ends up doing this, and he's discussing with him, and Netero ends up giving him his name, but then he's discussing about how humanity will not, because I mean Meruem kind of given to his like his policies and stuff like that, and what he plans to do as king, and how he plans on culling humanity so that he can have like the creme de la creme of humans to eat, and essentially make them. Essentially, he planned on giving like the Native American treatment in the Americas by putting them on a small reserve so they could like essentially breed them like cows and eat them. Now that didn't happen to the Native Americans, but it's a similar concept because of the reservation stuff. But yeah, we see as this happens, and Netero is like, "You think you'll let people do that? No, the militia of humans far exceeds what you believe in." And then he gets like this phenomenal scene where we see Netero like go to like almost like a demon-like visage, and this is the line. I actually didn't know this came from Hunter x Hunter, but this is where you hear, just then, the king felt true fear for the first time. And it's when this happens. And oh my gosh, that was literally peak cinema. Because, that Netero had aura to the very end. And then he blows up. He literally blows up in a nuclear bomb explosion. So what had happened was, before he even went to fight the Meruem, he had got a doctor to implant what is called a poor man's rose, essentially, in his heart. And this poor man's rose is a nuclear bomb, essentially, that have been outlawed predominantly in the Hunter world, but everyone kind of agreed to quit developing them, but no one wanted to discard their stockpiles. So they exist everywhere, but they're illegal to use. And why it's called the poor man's rose is that when it blows up, it makes like a instead of a mushroom cloud, it has a rose cloud. It's a very pretty bomb, but yeah, it is insanely destructive. And we see as Merylwyn gets blown essentially to smithereens. Now, this kind of leads to a break in all of like all the activities and stuff by the bodyguards. Because the bodyguards' main goal is to protect Merylwyn. So they all go rushing off. They're all like, we gotta get to Merylwyn. But what Merylwyn tasked Neferpito with before this big bomb and all this stuff, which actually happened before all this, was she was tasked with healing Komugi. Because like I said, Komugi got blasted through, and Komugi is very important to Merylwyn because he has not yet beat her, and that's very important to him. We see as she's healing him. And during all of this, we see as Gon and Killua find Neferpito. And they know who did, because they actually find Kite, because Kite was, like I said, was made into a puppet by Neferpito for practice, and they ultimately, and all the other hunters, end up finding him, retaking him, and they discover what she's done and reanimate his corpse in such a way. And they are disgusted by this, and they want their revenge on Neferpito. So they have found her, and Gon, he, like, snaps here. He loses his cool. He is just, like, he's dark here, because he's I mean, that's kind of a goofy term to use, but he, like, legit sitting like this and watches Neferpito for an hour, because he gives her an hour to heal Komugi, at least her vital injuries, because wouldn't even let her heal up fully, because he needed to fight her. So he's sitting there, and at one point, Poof ends up coming in and trying to dissuade him, and then does not end up happening. He tries to lure Gon off and all that stuff, does not happen. But yeah, so Gon is locked in, and he's staring here. At one point, he even threatens to kill Komugi. And that I don't know if he would have went through with it or not. Like, that's the thing. It's kind of questionable at that point. But yeah, so we then move on from that, and we see as Poof and Yuppie end up running off, and they go to save the king, but they find the king is legit dismembered and essentially a husk of what he was. But they end up ultimately giving their life source to him, and this allows him to regenerate. However, at this point, he has amnesia, and he doesn't remember anything. So they're holding him, and eventually they take him back to execute his duties and cull the 5 million people so that he can have the best of the best food, and they try to teach him his way slowly back. But Poof realizes that he cannot let Komugi become back into Merylwyn's memory, because Komugi is what made him more human, and Poof did not like that about Merylwyn. So this all ends up going, and we see like these shenanigans of him trying to keep Komugi from being remembered. He actually goes and like takes off the Gungi board before Merylwyn can get back to the throne room so that he doesn't remember. And we actually see as after Komugi is healed, we see as she's eventually captured by Palm and Ikalgo, and this leads to them running off. And once Merylwyn actually gets to that palace, he ends up capturing Knuckle and Melioron, and this leads to a precarious situation. But then we see as Neferpito and Gon go off and go to prepare to fight. And they go back and they meet at... I'm just going to tell this part first since it's the more interesting. But we see as Kite... And they go and watch Kite because Neferpito took Kite... Well, Gon took Neferpito there so that there's like safe house. And he took her there so that she could heal Kite. But then she reveals, yo, I can't kill Kite because I can't bring people back from the dead. And she reveals how he died in their fight. And we see at this point also how Poof is able to alter the genetics of his segments, because we see as a character by the name of Welfin who had some brief encounters with Ikalgo while he was trying to infiltrate, but ultimately Ikalgo was able to convince Welfin to come over to their side. However, Poof runs into him, and he's able to convince him to give him a call to Neferpito, where ultimately he's like, yo, we found Komugi, and Poof alters his segment to sound like Komugi and use her visage so that Pito believes that Komugi has been saved, so she has no reason to heal Kite now. And so we see this, and ultimately Gon loses his cool once he learns this. He absolutely snaps. And this is such a sick scene, because we see Gon transform into this beast of a man. Like, he's this little, like, 14-year-old kid. He gets jacked. And, like, we see him turning, like, this black shadow thing first. And then we see as his full form is revealed. And Pito tries to attack him at one point. Bro obliterates her. And then ultimately they end up moving into a forest. And through this, because he didn't want to destroy the safe house, they take him out there. Gon goes to town. Holy smokes. We see as he hits her with a John Kim Po Show Me Rock thing. And it obliterates her. Like, and then we see as Killua was looking for Gon because he's like, crap, he's done snapped or something. And he sees just in the distance just flashes of John Kim Po's going. Because Gon is beating Neferpito's face in. Like, legit, he beats it to there's no even remnant of it. And then we see as Killua eventually finds him, and he's like, yo, Gon, you gotta stop. And Gon's like, okay, I do gotta stop. He's kind of like crying because Gon is conscious during all this. Like, he did that for his own volition. Like, he's conscious, he's crying, he knows what he's done. And I honestly love that because, like, I've never seen a shonen protagonist break that way. At least like, not in my memory. But that was like, we just see him just like, I was not expecting to see a shonen protagonist absolutely throw hands with a corpse, just bludgeoning. Like, that was Omni-Man level stuff. Like, it was worse than Omni-Man. But, yeah, we just see this, and eventually Pito's corpse actually is living via the use of her little puppet thing. And she tries to attack Gon, and she's able to cut off his arm, but Killua ends up pushing him out of the way so she can't do a mortal wound to him. And Gon then uses his arm. He grabs Pito, throws her up, puts her down on the ground, throws his arm through her, then performs an armless John Kim Po and blasts her. What was that? That was awesome. Holy smokes. I was not expecting this. Like, oh my goodness. I cannot explain how hype this was. Like, this was straight aura, and it was scary, and it was good. Phenomenal shonen storytelling. Like, holy smokes. But, then we're going to go into the less interesting stuff. What we see is Meruem slowly actually does acquire more and more information towards what Komugi is doing. And we eventually see as Palm is able to safely secure Komugi in, like, the underground area of the palace with the help of Ikalgo. But at one point, we see as he senses another nin, someone responding to his nin in the crowds of the people, like he did with Knuckle and Melly Railroad. And he actually ends up going and finding that it's Welfin. Now, we see as him and Welfin talk briefly, and Poof is actually scared that Welfin knows what is going on because he knows that Welfin has betrayed him, betrayed the king, and he's worried that he knows the secret about Komugi and he's going to tell the king because all the king has to hear is Komugi and then he'll be back to his old self. But we see as Poof try to slow this down, but ultimately, out of the straight fear of dying and of the king, or of Meruem, we see as like Welfin gets like completely aged down to like an old toothless dog. He's a wolf kind of looking chimera ant, and he gets like completely aged down, and he ends up during this like discussion of him getting completely aged, he sees his brain starts working in a way that has never worked before, and then he remembers as his last word Komugi, and this flips the switch in Meruem, and he goes off to find Komugi, which he ultimately ends up finding Palm. He ends up talking with her, and we see as she ultimately reveals where Komugi is because she sees that the king has truly changed and he will not harm them. So he ultimately goes off and plays with Komugi. Now we see throughout all this, because prior we'd actually seen as when Welfin was actually trying to run away, that he shot at Yuppie, who had been turned down to a little like fairy thing, because when Poof and Yuppie used all their life force to give into Meruem to revitalize him, we see as they got kind of like the fairy form, but Poof still has his full form because it was just a segment. But yeah, we see as they also kind of like bleeding from the nose and all that stuff, and we see as like Yuppie, he did get shot by Welfin, but he didn't die of that. He died of this bleeding. And we see a flash where Poof is on the ground, and he's drugged himself, and he's been bleeding on the ground. But then everyone kind of goes off. We see as the hunters successfully get off the land and all that, and we see as Netero's kind of announcing his kind of loss of his position because he's dead, because he blew himself up. But we see that, and we see as Meruem and Komugi kind of play their game, and ultimately he reveals to Komugi that he will not be there much longer, because what happened when the poor man's rose exploded, it essentially left like a poison-like contagious radiation for the people that were around it and affected by it. So Poof and Yuppie were obviously affected by it because they ran up on it like right after it had happened. So that's why they died. They got poisoned. And we see as Meruem kind of plays his last game with Komugi, and we see it's very heartwarming. We see them discuss and all that stuff and kind of stay together as the true friends they are. And it's very sweet, very sweet. And we just see as ultimately Meruem ends up dying off because of the poison of the poor man's rose. But then we have our conclusion, and we see as everyone's kind of healing up, we see how the Chimera ants are allowed, the ones that are actually human and stuff, are allowed to live in this nature reserve that now is the NGL. The NGL's people have been evacuated, and they are no longer living in that area. The dictatorship is overthrown, and we actually see that the Diego who was killed in the palace fight wasn't even actually the real Diego. The real one has been living on a farm for 30 years. And we see as Bezef is made an international criminal, and he runs off with Welfin and a couple other Chimera ants. And we see as Knuckle is on the phone with Colt, who is one of the Chimera ants at the mansion in the safe house area, and he's talking with him, and they're talking about a character by the name of Reyna. And this character, I don't even know where this came from, but it's disgusting. And this character isn't Reyna. She keeps calling herself Kite, and this freaks Moral out. I might have said Nove, but it freaks Moral out. Moral goes and ends up telling Gon and Killua, and we see that Gon is trying to live with every ounce of his being, but due to his ability that he used, it absorbed like years of his life, kind of like Gear 2 did originally in the One Piece, and due to his massive transformation at just the young age that Gon is at, he lost probably a lot of his life, and he's on life support at the moment. But we see as Nove and all the other hunters, like, we will do anything to keep Gon alive, because he is the hero, essentially, who saved a lot of people by killing Neferpitou. But yeah, so then we also see as these two Chimera ants who were eaten, because like all the Chimera ants have some, well, most of the Chimera ants have some memory of their human selves if they were spawned from the eating of human flesh, like we see with Welfin, Ikalgo. Welfin and Ikalgo had like a friendship in their human life, and we also see as Welfin, after the events, end up going off and looking for this dude by the name of Gyro, who is one of his best friends. And we see these two, who were actually these children who got eaten, end up going to their home village, and they make amends and all that, and they're actually taken back in by their village because they realize who they were and what happened to them. But, yeah, that's all there really is. We do see that at the end of the 136th episode, we see as multiple of the Zodiac leaders have pulled up to the Hunter like association area to partake in the 13th chairman selection, which is the next arc. So I'm ready to see that. We actually get to see Gene there. But yeah. Oh my gosh, that arc was phenomenal. Like I said, in the first half, I really didn't know how much I was going to like it because it was really slow. But then, like I said, Zeno and Netero descended from the heavens. That literally where it got good. It got so good. Literally one of like the best plot accelerators in all of fiction. Like, I loved it. That arc was phenomenal. It flipped Shonen in a way that Shonen hasn't really went from what I've read and saw, or at least Battle Shonen. So I was like, oh, that was a phenomenal arc. Like, Meruem, in my opinion, was honestly very similar to Cell, but I liked Meruem more than Cell, like Dragon Ball Z Cell, because, I don't know, he just seemed like more of a growing character. Like, Cell's whole entire thing throughout the whole thing was to become perfect and to just obliterate everything. But Meruem, we see as he develops as a character. Meruem's more of a character than Cell was. So I really like to see Meruem. It was kind of, I guess, sad to not see him get a more harsh death, because, I mean, he did kill children and stuff like that. He wiped out a bunch of people. But it was also a really fitting ending for him. So I love to see all this. And just the Chimera arc in general was phenomenal. Like I said, I love the transformations. Killua's transformation, Gon's transformation, Netero, though, and I know Netero's isn't transformation, but that bomb was sick too. Like, the animation is phenomenal in this arc, as it is in all of Hunter x Hunter. But yeah, I mean, I just love to see it. This arc was so good, and I see why a lot of people refer to it as one of the best arcs in Shonen, because it honestly is. Chimera Ant arc was phenomenal. It had some, like, the most aura, I know that's a very childish thing, but it had the most aura moments, some of the most aura moments in all of Shonen that I've read. So, yeah, if you are near the Chimera arc and like, you're losing hope because of the earlier parts of it, keep watching, because you will get hooked later on. And, yeah, so, I mean, that's all I really have to say about the Chimera arc. Like I said, I loved it so much. It was phenomenal all around. I loved the character development. I loved, like I said, especially the latter half. Yeah, that's all there really is for the Chimera Ant arc and episode 62 of Shelf Review. So, thank you very much for watching.